Since we are running a little bit short on time, we're going right into our next and last presentation on Senate Bill 150, which has potential for significant impact on provider care of transgender youth. And our two presenters for this Senate Bill 150 presentation are Dr. Amber Pendleton and Dr. Corey Shapiro. Dr. Pendleton is professor of pediatrics at the University of Louisville School of Medicine. She's a general pediatrician at the Norton Children Medical Group, and she obtained her medical degree from the University of Kentucky, and her pediatrics residency was completed at the University of Virginia. During her general pediatric career, she is focused on integrating mental health services within the primary care setting, as well as improving health equity through advocacy and building community partnerships. Dr. Corey Shapiro is the legal director for the ACLU of Kentucky. He earned his BA degree from Washington University in St. Louis and his JD degree from George Washington University Law School. He served as a litigator with two international law firms, both in Washington, D.C. and Chicago. And in addition to his commercial litigation practice, he has also worked on civil liberties cases pro bono. He won the Lead On Award from Access Living in 2012 after successfully pursuing adequate housing for adults with disabilities in Illinois. He joined the ACLU in Kentucky in 2018, and he serves on the board of directors for several organizations, including the Jewish Council for Public Affairs and the Legal Aid Society. Drs. Pendleton and Shapiro, thank you so much for being with us this morning and for sharing your expertise on Senate Bill 150.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. I have learned so much this morning from all of the speakers, but I really must say that the incredible youth have been so brave in sharing their stories and answering our questions. It's just been really a pleasure. So thanks for arranging it. So I'm also thankful that you have given us the opportunity to talk about the overview and implications of Kentucky Senate Bill 150. So we all know today's symposium is really focused on, building resilience in vulnerable populations of children. And we all know that legislative action really can have a profound impact on the health of children, and it has intended and unintended consequences. And I'll tell you that over the years, I've really learned this firsthand as a primary care pediatrician, really working to take care of some of the most vulnerable children in our state. And so in March of this year, Kentucky passed a bill that directly affects children's access to health knowledge and access to health care. And as pediatric care providers, it's critical that we understand the laws that affect child health. And that's why we invited an expert, Corey Shapiro, the director of ACLU Kentucky, to join us today. Our objectives are to understand these key elements of this particular bill and the impact on pediatric health. We also are going to integrate this knowledge into clinical practice to talk about how we can promote resilience in Kentucky youth. So to start, we're going to look at just an overview of who this bill affects. So one major group is certainly transgender youth, and it affects their access to hormones and surgery for gender-affirming care. But it also has an effect on all Kentucky students regarding sexual education, confidentiality, and school healthcare consent. And there's an overlap of both. Where transgender youth at school, this bill has comments on pronoun use as well as bathroom use. So we ask ourselves, why are we all talking about this bill being a threat to child health? And the reality is this, and I think the most prominent thing to know is that this bill directly contradicts recommendations of major medical organizations regarding really two different concepts, both gender affirming care as well as comprehensive sexual education. And because of that, that it's not going along with what we know is providing the standard of care for children, it really threatens already vulnerable populations of children. We know Kentucky has a high rate of child abuse and neglect. We certainly know that transgender youth have incredibly high rates of suicidality and mental health disorders. So I want to talk about, when we know that children face threats, I want us to come together today and really think about this as we talk. That, the question is really, what can we do right now? And I want us to remember that when children face threats, the pediatric care provider is really working with every child and family. We do have a unique superpower. Whether you're a therapist, a social worker, whether you're a community health worker or pediatrician or psychiatrist, we are collecting stories day in and day out, and we can change the care we provide directly, but we can also be a loud voice and advocate. And I think that the one thing we can remember, the foundation for this, is that we all have the shared goal that's the same. We want children and families to thrive, really no matter how we get there. So let's talk about, just as a reminder, certainly, what does it take to thrive? And I think if we're all on the same page here, it's really helpful. The best strategy is prevention, right? So for kids to not have to go through stresses, but it doesn't always happen that way. And we know that every single child will face stress, but vulnerable children face undue stress. And we know that severely affects not just their childhood, but it affects their lifelong health way into adulthood. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, when faced with adversity, how do we help them bounce back? Or even better, how do we help children bounce forward? I'm going to use the science of stress to really have a foundation of understanding this bill and understanding its impacts. So we know that if a very large growling bear, walked into the room, or we know if a child was experiencing a severe bullying episode, same concept, same thing happens in our body. Our deep brain, our amygdala, sends signals out in a rapid pace to various parts of our body, the rest of our brain, as well as our adrenal glands. And we have some options about what can happen. So one, we can just freeze and stand still, hoping the bear doesn't see us, hoping the bully doesn't see us. Or our amygdala can stimulate our adrenal glands to pump out intense amounts of stress hormones, such as epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. And those hormones help us fight, become aggressive, or it helps us run. There's also another pathway, and this is the pathway I want to highlight today specifically, and that is when our amygdala talks to our posterior pituitary gland and sends out oxytocin. And so this helps us affiliate. So if a bear comes into a room, we're going to try to huddle together. We're going to get closer together to be safe. The same thing can happen with a bully. You're going to affiliate or try to join groups, and that is a much better stress response. So we need to remember something, that if we don't have the opportunity to affiliate, to come together, to feel safe, to have somebody who's going to look out for you and protect you, then we're stuck with these other opportunities here, So we're either going to freeze, we're going to fight, we're going to run. And we need to remember that these pathways are not healthy if they're constantly stimulated and become dysregulated over time. So the stress response system over time really is pumping out an insane amount of hormones that are not supposed to be present in the body at all times. And we know that stress, we've heard it earlier today as well, it affects every single system in our bodies. Primarily our brains when we're in childhood. It causes effects on the gut, cardiovascular system, the immune system, everything. And so when we're thinking about how do we overcome that, we need to be really building buffering environments. We need to be supporting children and helping them build safety. And so we want to stimulate the affiliate response. So we're coming together to have a positive stress response. So I think we should ask ourselves, what are the messages that are being sent to children in our state? Are we sending the message, you are special, you are safe, and you are worth it? So I want to better understand what Kentucky children are facing and how to promote resilience. And so I'm going to hand it over to Corey Shapiro.
Thank you, Dr. Pendleton, and thank you all for having me. So kids are facing a lot right now, a lot of attacks on their education, and in particular, a lot of attacks on their ability to thrive, as Dr. Pendleton has put, especially youth who identify as LGBTQ. SB 150 is part of a national effort. I've put a link here at the ACLU website where you can see all across the country what's happening, especially in conservative legislatures around the country. Each state is facing it a little differently. Kentucky, we had a bill that was initially introduced that was really, really bad in the context of healthcare, probably the worst in the country. It changed. It's really hard to follow if you're not a lawyer, if you're not following the legislature, if you're not a lobbyist. In the end, it was a rush. It sort of exemplified how horrible our state legislature is in terms of providing thoughtful, transparent policymaking. And we're going to go through a little bit what the end result was of that SB 150. And the biggest harm that we're seeing immediately in your context is the ban on specific types of gender-affirming care. But all aspects of SB 150 are existential threats to trans youth. Our current focus here at the ACLU of Kentucky, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, is the litigation challenging the constitutionality of the actual ban on the use of puberty blockers and hormone therapy. But we're here to make sure that everybody is being fought for and able to live their full and authentic lives. I'm ready for the next slide. So let's talk a little about what SB 150 does not do. And I think it's really important so that you all are able to do what you need to do for your patients. It does not restrict any form of mental health care or other gender-affirming care for transgender youth. Other than puberty blockers and hormone therapy and specific surgeries, there is no other restrictions on your ability to provide patient care. It does not require any healthcare provider, any individual in the state of Kentucky to use pronouns of the sex assigned at birth. It also does not prohibit any care providers outside of school from keeping information confidential. We will talk about what it does in terms of healthcare providers or other professionals in the school setting, but outside of that, there are no limits on your ethical obligations to maintain confidentiality. It also does not prohibit any out-of-state travel to access or provide gender-affirming care. That was something that was in the initial bill that got a lot of attention, but then they did remove that later, in part because of all the outrage. Protests and showing up is important and it is powerful and can be an important buffer to protect youth. It also doesn't impact any drag performances. That bill was dropped. We may see that come back in January. The legislature comes back on January 2nd, and it's unclear what they might do next session. So how does SB 150 impact all students? So the first issue is that it's going to require parents to opt in for any sexual education curriculum. From what I've been told, that is not a best practice. The best practice is to provide the care, and if parents want to opt out, they can opt out. But this puts a significant burden also on the school to make sure that they are not somehow going to be accused of providing a student who did not have an opt-in with the appropriate comprehensive sexual education. The way the bill was drafted, and I think I mentioned earlier that it was a rush at the very last minute, in a non-transparent way to get it passed on the last day of the session. What they did was sort of a drafting error where they put an or where we think they may have meant an and. And so school districts are now faced with an option of either limiting sex education under 5th grade so that no 5th grader or below can get any sex education, or prohibiting any discussion on school curriculum from covering where the purpose of it is to talk about gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation at any grade level. We've seen in Fayette County, Lexington, and Jefferson County, Louisville, those school boards have opted for the or option and gone with the first option, which is limiting any sex education for fifth graders and below, which has resulted in the loss of curriculum that is in opposition to the state standards. We likely will see that possibly that fix is made and it becomes an and those school districts are forced to eliminate both options. Next slide. And so also for all students, parental consent is required for any healthcare services, especially including services related to human sexuality or family planning. Emergency mental health services, though, do not require any consent. And again, it does prohibit the schools from keeping any student information, especially about their sexual identity, their gender identity, confidential from parents. And I'll turn it back over to Dr. Pendleton to talk about the comprehensive sex education goals.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate that. So let's talk about what is comprehensive sex education a little bit. But before we do, I do want to clarify, when we've talked about this as, pediatric care providers, a lot of people say that, it's not really been provided anyway. It's not like we're getting it taken away because it's not consistent. However, I do want to say that, because we know that comprehensive sex education is what is recommended, it's evidence-based, it's medically accurate, and also takes into consideration children's developmental levels. And so I think we're getting further away from what would be helpful to Kentucky children, right? We're going the wrong direction. So, one of the things that's important to note about it is that it also includes talking about healthy relationships, things like consent and abuse prevention. It talks a lot about personal safety, and it has a positive and an affirming approach. So when it's provided correctly, we know the outcomes are pretty remarkable. And this is from over 3 decades of research. It reduces sexual activity and unprotected sex, increases contraception use, lowers LGBTQ bullying. It even decreases domestic violence and intimate partner violence. We know it improves social emotional learning, communication skills, and development of healthy relationships. And so I can't imagine anyone would argue that these are things that we need desperately in Kentucky. So with that being said, knowing that it's not allowed in the same way that it is designed to improve outcomes, what can we do right now to promote resiliency? Well, so it certainly depends on what kind of way that you're interacting with children and families and how you can apply knowing that this is happening and knowing that we still have to work together to improve outcomes. I think starting with just asking permission, I think in general, when we're seeing children and families, asking permission to talk about anything hard may be one of the more trauma-informed ways that we can communicate, to say, hey, is it okay if, and fill in the blank. And so I think talking about it, knowing that it's not going to be something learned in school in the same way is important. And remembering that we need to be the ones explaining confidentiality. It's important we're all sharing resources that are evidence-based and that are appropriate for age. And so I wanted to share with you an article that I find so remarkably helpful called Sexuality Education for Children and Adolescents. It was published in Pediatrics back in 2016. It's very comprehensive. It's great if you need a paper to use for advocating for this, for advocating for sexual education, but it really includes some really awesome resources, not just for schools and healthcare providers, but many resources for youth. And I've listed a couple of those there. So what about the confidentiality piece? I mean, we know that almost all parents and teens agree that confidential care is important. And this is a free poster that if you wanted to post in your office, it's from the American Academy of Pediatrics. And I think posting signs about confidentiality can help open that conversation. And it certainly is an opportunity for us to be clear about the difference in confidentiality at school versus when talking with a healthcare provider. So just for kids to know that, yeah, if they do tell the teacher something, that is not protected from, parents knowing about it, but absolutely can be if they tell a mental health provider outside of school or a community mental health provider that's seeing them in school, as well as a healthcare provider. There's also a lot of great posters about confidentiality. Here's another one. There are many others. Speak Your Mind, it's healthy. It just encourages teens to ask about having confidential time with their provider. And I'll hand it back to you, Corey.
So what does, the question remains, what does the SB 150 provide and require people to do in school with trans youth? It allows the school staff to misgender the trans youth. I call it sort of let bad actors. It's the let bad actors be bad actors. You can use other words for that euphemism, but essentially, there are going to be teachers who are not supportive, and this simply allows them to be not supportive. Supportive staff, though, still can use the student's correct pronouns, and we're hopeful that the teachers will care about their kids and use the correct pronouns. But there's nothing that will require disciplinary action against staff who are cruel to their own kids, which is unfortunate. It also directs schools to adopt policies that will prevent the trans youth from using the bathroom that's concordant with their gender. This does not, there are some exceptions to this, and we're seeing some school districts, try and figure ways around this, whether it's through providing reasonable accommodations. If a student has some sort of a 502 plan or under the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, requiring those accommodations, that is an option that we're seeing some schools go and try and help their students. But in school districts where the board is not supportive, it's going to be very difficult, and we're going to see trans youth face significant obstacles and in the ability to use the facilities that are concordant with their gender. And with respect to the trans youth healthcare ban, it prohibits medically necessary medical care. We know what the best practices, the AMA, the American Association of Pediatrics, the Society of Pediatric Endocrinology, all agree that puberty blockers and hormone therapies are the most effective form of treatment for youth who are diagnosed with gender dysphoria. But in terms of what this bill actually does, there's no criminal penalties. It's a loss of licensure. What that means is that the scope is limited, even though the impact is broad. So it essentially bans all of the healthcare that is necessary, but it's limited to a loss of licensure, which limits the scope of who could be facing penalties. So somebody who makes a referral, somebody who provides therapeutic care in therapy, somebody who provides supportive care to families is not going to be subject to this ban. It is limited to a loss of licensure by the Board of Medical Licensure or the Board of Nursing. It also allows for those providers who are currently providing treatment or were currently providing treatment at the time that the law went into effect. It did allow for a systematic reduction or some tapering if the provider felt that immediate termination of treatment would cause harm to the minor. You certainly should consult with any attorney before deciding how to sort of interpret that, but it does allow for some tapering for those who were on treatment at the time. And so here's just sort of identifying specifically what that law does, and it is limited to prescribing or administering any puberty blocker, prescribing or administering any hormone therapy, performing any sterilizing surgery, which from what I understand is not being done in Kentucky, and certainly any referral if for some reason there was somebody who needed to be referred for that type of treatment, that would also not be considered within the scope of SB 150. And as well as any sort of performing any surgery in terms of tissue, those types of surgeries also would not be considered, are banned, but any referral would not be. And again, it just is limited to the revocation of license. There's no criminal scope to this bill.
So let's think about a little bit about the trans youth experience at school. And then I'm also going to tie that in with the experience of transgender adults. So in a survey in 2015, in the United States, of over 28,000 children who were perceived to be transgender between kindergarten and 8th grade, these are devastating statistics. Over half said they were verbally harassed, a quarter physically assaulted, 13% sexually assaulted, and 17% left school because of maltreatment. Now, I think that if we know that this is happening, right, we should be putting all our effort into making sure that this stops. And I think knowing that this is the facts, right? This is what their experience has been at school, and not just at school, but in the community as well. And so I want us to also kind of shift and think about the results of this survey. So same, the United States survey about the same time, but over 500,000 transgender adults. The statistics were staggering, that they experienced worse mental health, higher rates of disability, and multiple chronic conditions. And so I think this is a really easy, connection that we can make now that we really understand trauma. We understand resilience. We understand that traumatic stress can lead directly to chronic disease. And so I think making these connections are really critical for us to help our legislators understand where we need to be putting our legislative efforts. So gender affirming care is recognized as standard of care, period. It's recognized by major medical organizations, and I've listed just a few. And there are 20 more. This even includes the World Health Organization. And so we're going to talk about what gender affirming care means. It's a big spectrum. It's not just medicine and surgery, but probably the thing that we need to really focus our efforts on are understanding that it decreases rates of depression and attempted suicide in the most vulnerable population of children in this area. We know that transgender students and youth experience suicidality in some of the highest rates of any group. And in a survey of over 34,000 youth, if those children receive gender affirming care, it dropped the rates at least by 25% for both depression and attempted suicide. So what does it mean to provide gender affirming care? And so I think, if we use the definition from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, it's an array of services. You can look at WPATH and a lot of other organizations that are specific at addressing, transgender youth health. And they all say the same thing, which is it's not just medical and surgical support, but it's a lot of mental health support. It's a lot of connecting children to community resources. And everyone agrees that early gender affirming care is crucial to overall health. So some points that are made in the AAP policy statement called Ensuring Comprehensive Care and Support for Transgender and Gender Diverse Children. It was published in 2018, pointed out a couple things that I really want to highlight. And I think these are important kind of facts just to know that you can share with others when you're also trying to advocate. But transgender identities and diverse gender expressions do not constitute a mental health disorder. Variations in our gender identity and expression are normal aspects of human diversity. And so if a mental health issue exists, it often stems from stigma and negative experiences, and it's not intrinsic to the child necessarily. So I think that's an important part to remember when we're going out and to provide gender affirming care. Just because we can't prescribe and administer hormones or perform surgery, but the rest of the gender affirming care is absolutely legal and is the right thing to do. So today we've had a really wonderful panel of children share their voice with us. And so I'm going to just have to paraphrase here instead of having a youth tell you, which is way better. But there was an article published just last month in Pediatrics. And in this article, they interviewed trans youth as well as their caregivers, and they asked, what do you want in your clinical experience? And I'm going to summarize. It's a great article if you're interested in reading it, and I'm going to just highlight some of the main points. So one thing is they said, yes, please, please, please create a welcoming environment. And we all know that that there has been an increase in number of signs and rainbow pins and statements, but those are important. Keep doing that, and encourage that in any environment to just signal that this is a safe place. In this particular article, both children and parents agreed that every single patient really should be asked about their gender identity and asked about their preferred pronouns. But they don't want it to happen in front of everyone or in front of their parents. In fact, they prefer it to be on an intake form that is private, and they really want it or behind closed doors when you have your confidential discussion, because they really strongly feel that privacy about that is important. They strongly believed it's important to use their affirmed name as well as their pronouns. And you think about, when we talk about that stress response system, walking into a clinic, being unsure about whether or not you're in a safe place, for someone to use your affirmed name and your pronouns, you're going to automatically, stimulate that affiliation response, right? Instead of freezing or feeling aggressive and angry and wanting to fight or wanting to run and having your body flooded with stress hormones, instead you're going to feel safe and know that you're affiliating with a safe group and a safe place. They do want a gender neutral bathroom to be available. So you can imagine that if you're saying with your words that you are supportive of gender diversity, but then you have gendered bathrooms, I think it's not really putting your actions in the right place. And so I think if you notice that maybe you have gendered bathrooms where you're working right now, that could be something you could advocate for changing. They want us to all have affirming and inclusive resources and referrals. And so I would say if, when you have the time to be able to build these things as a system, whether you're in a clinic or working in the community, but really putting a lot of effort into this right now and collecting these resources is very important. I've been asked a lot, how do you find what's good? How do you find what kids really connect with and what helps families the most? I think one great way is to show up at some of the community events, for example, some of the Pride festivals, because you can see who else is showing up in the community, who else is bringing their support, and what type of support do they bring. I hear all the time that using pronouns is difficult for some people. And sometimes you say, I want to do it, but it just doesn't make sense to me. It's hard. But I just want to say that, remember, this signals safety. This signals that you not just accept, but kind of celebrate a person, that you see them for who they are and who they want to be. And so I hear this kind of commonly. I just wanted to talk about it because I hear it a lot, that, I just can't use the singular they, when a person decides that they want their pronouns to be they, them, for example. Well, I heard a great talk, if you're interested, by Archie Crowley, who is a linguist, and they had a TED Talk around gender identity and how it evolves regarding language. And so what Archie said is, think about, what do you call someone before you know their gender? So you say, if you're talking about maybe a neighbor or a teacher, you can say, what's their name? And that's a pretty common way. So we already use singular they all the time. And then my favorite way to think through this is really, I think, near and dear to my Kentucky heart, because it thinks about, what do you call a parent's mother? Well, you call a parent's mother whatever they want to be called, right? So there's never a right answer. You may call someone grandma, Gigi, Nana, Mama, Mima, and we're all right now thinking about these people and how important they are in all of our lives. And can you imagine telling them what they're going to be called? You never do that. You just respect it. And I think that's a really great point that we can make in respecting youth and what their preferences are. So how do we help trans youth affiliate? How do we help them create safe spaces? Well, I want to start out with this is also a staggering fact that we can share wide about why it's so important to promote family and friend acceptance. So there was a study of over 400 teens, and there were suicide attempts in 4% if they had strongly supportive parents, family, friends, but as high as 60% in those who reported they had parents who were not supportive. Think about that statistic. I mean, really let it sit there, because, where I think a lot of our effort needs to go is in helping family and friends go through. It's incredibly tough for them too, right? It's not something that we say, oh, just accept it. And they say, okay, it's a incredible process to go through. And I think that if they know the statistic, right, it gives them an important goal to reach, because we all want kids to thrive, right? And so some of the things we can do when we're working directly with youth is just making sure that they're safe, that we work on those preventative strategies to avoid trauma. We also want to connect them to community resources that are supportive, that are gender affirming. When we make a referral, even to a dental office, for example, that's an opportunity to help research and understand which offices are supportive and which may not be as much on that plan or journey. And I think that remembering that, acceptance really isn't enough when we're working with these, youth, because they do face trauma and discrimination and bullying in a way that is very intense. And so we can't just accept them and say, oh yeah, we accept you. We have to celebrate them. We have to be the ones telling them that they're special, that you're safe and you're worth it.
And I'm going to go through a few slides just to clear up and just to show what our litigation around healthcare, around the healthcare ban has, how it's gone forward. It's been very complicated, even for me, who has been practicing law for almost 20 years. I've never had something this complicated in a short span of time. And so I'm sure for all of you, it's been sort of confusing. The ultimate unfortunate result is that as of today, the ban is in effect. So the bill was passed on March 17th, and it was set to go into effect, the healthcare part, on June 29th. So on May 4th, on behalf of 7 transgender youth and their families, who, as Dr. Penna was just talking about, are just amazing kids, and I will do anything I can to protect them and fight for them. Their families are facing serious challenges, and it's just a privilege to be able to fight for them. And so on May 4th, we filed our lawsuit against the State Board of Medical Licensure, as well as the State Board of Nursing and the Cabinet for Health and Family Services, because they also do some licensing that could be impacted, to prevent the gender affirming care ban from going into effect. That was in May. Next slide. On May 22nd, we filed a motion for what's called preliminary injunction. That is asking the court to put the law on hold while the case is pending. So we would expect this case overall, until final judgment in the trial court, to last possibly 2 years. So in the meantime, we want the court to say there's a likelihood of success, that we're going to win, and this is really important and would cause irreparable damage to our clients. So the court we're asking the court to stop the law from going into effect while the case is pending during the duration of the lawsuit. The day before the law went into effect, you can imagine all the sort of anticipation of what's going to happen. The day before, the judge granted our preliminary injunction. A week later, meanwhile, in Tennessee, a similar law had been passed, and also a court in Tennessee was faced with a preliminary injunction request and granted it. That injunction ruling was appealed to the Sixth Circuit, as was ours. And the Sixth Circuit quickly put a hold on the preliminary injunction, blocking that and allowing the Tennessee law to go into effect. At the same time, the court saw our case was pending too in the Sixth Circuit and said, we're going to consolidate, for purposes of argument, these 2 cases, Tennessee and Kentucky. Our law, though, was still blocked when the Sixth Circuit did this. Next slide. This is on a Saturday morning at about 1 a.m., just to give you all some context. July 14th, so a week later, our court said, I still think I was right, but the Sixth Circuit has signaled to us that they're probably going to reject my ruling that the laws are unconstitutional. So I'm going to allow the ban to go into effect while the appeal is pending. So on July 14th was the first day that the healthcare ban went into effect. 2 weeks later, immediately after that, we had filed a motion asking the Sixth Circuit, knowing that we might lose, but we had to fight for our kids, denied our emergency motion to stop that from happening, and they allowed the ban to remain in effect. About a month later, the court heard oral arguments on the appeal of the preliminary injunction. So all that was emergency motion practice, and now we actually got to the meat of the preliminary injunction on September 1st. There were oral arguments. It was the Friday at 3 o'clock on before Labor Day weekend. And then a month later, on September 28th, we got the result that we had feared ever since the beginning of July, which was that the Sixth Circuit reversed Judge Hale, who is our trial court judge, decision on the preliminary injunction, and ruled that there was no constitutional right to this type of healthcare, and the ban did not violate the Constitution. That happened on September 28th. Today, we announced this a few days ago, but today we are filing with the Supreme Court a petition for certiorari, which is asking the Supreme Court to hear the case, arguing that what the Sixth Circuit did was out of line with the Constitution, with Supreme Court precedent, and that the court should hear this case and ultimately reverse the Sixth Circuit. We don't know whether that's going to happen. The fact that there are multiple trial courts that all have agreed that these types of bans are unconstitutional in Alabama and Arkansas and Florida and Georgia and in Kentucky, we're hopeful that that type of disparity amongst the courts and the appellate courts that are somewhat divided, we're hoping that will cause the Supreme Court to take up our case as well as the Tennessee case. We're also hopeful that if, because it's an issue of such importance and such publicity, that we think that that's another factor the court will look at. The court gets a lot of cases that people are wanting them to hear. They hear a very, 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 very small number of cases every year. But we're hoping those two factors will influence the court to agree that they should review the case. And so we're going to keep fighting, and that's what we're doing. And the case will eventually go back to the lower court, and we will litigate the case. We'll have discovery, we'll have expert witnesses and expert opinions, and hope that the lower court will continue to agree. So what can we all do to make sure our kids are able to thrive here in Kentucky? Talk to the local school district about all of these things that Dr. Pendleton has been talking about in terms of making what we know will help kids thrive. You can follow the ACLU of Kentucky during the legislative session. They don't often hear, although they may ignore, voices from the medical community. A lot of times they hear from, I wouldn't say the most credible experts from outside of Kentucky, but when it comes to actually hearing from Kentucky medical voices, it's really important to let them know what the medical community here in Kentucky thinks. Contact your elected representatives. Have your family and friends contact them. If anybody you know, any of your patients you know are facing challenges, have them contact a lawyer about how the policies might impact your family. Also encourage the community to be safe on social media. I'm sure there are lots of best practices out there. I'm not an expert on that. I know when I'm facing things on social media, I just turn it off, and that's my practice. But some people don't even want to be on social media, and that's okay. And engage the youth voice. I caught the tail end of the panelists. It's always great to hear from youth. They make for great testimonies, for great understanding, for people to understand the issues they're facing. It's best to hear from them. And so we want to hear more from them. Just get engaged. It's really important. And there are other resources we have. ACLU of Kentucky, Kentucky Health Justice Network, Campaign for Southern Equality. Those three in particular are organizations which may be able to put people in touch with additional resources to access critical care, gender affirming care outside of Kentucky for people who need to have those resources. And I think, thank you so much. This has been great to be able to provide this to this audience and to help answer any questions you may have.
Thank you all so much. That was a wonderful presentation, and I think answered so many questions with regard to SB 150. We do have a couple of questions. And if you, let me read the first one from Melanie Ashworth. Since SB 150 goes against FERPA's rules on privacy infringement and lack of confidentiality, are schools actually following this? My understanding is that it goes against federal regulation and that the federal regulation would take precedence.
I can try to answer that question with a non-answer, which is that it's a great question. It's hard to answer how that would happen in the abstract in terms of actually filing litigation. I think the school districts will need to address that and figure that one out. And if there is an instance like that, I would love to hear about it. And we would love to talk to a school district that's facing with that exact challenge. It's hard to say in the abstract to be able to challenge it exactly, but we're looking at all different ways to challenge SB 150.
Okay, thank you very much. And there was another question as to whether SB 150 would impact extracurricular activities at school, I think. Any thoughts on that?
That's a great question. It should not, but it's certainly something that we would want to know if a school decides to ban an extracurricular activity. What will that do to that school? We haven't heard of anything yet, and how that will impact extracurriculars, because it's not the school providing the actual curriculum, so it shouldn't be part of it. I mean, it's extracurricular sort of. I don't mean to be too cute on that, but that's sort of the point of it, is that it's not teacher led, it's student led, so it should be okay. But again, if there are, we hear challenges even before SB 150 and ways we can provide support to students who want to start some type of a club, like a Gay Straight Alliance club. There's a question about children born intersex. There is an explicit exception for that in SB 150 that should apply to children who are born intersex. And I see Dr. Pendleton shaking her head, so I think she's looked at it as well.
Yes, it's really explicit and clear on that. That is definitely an exception to the rule.
Well, thank you both again so much. I think that was just very, very helpful for all of us to have a better understanding of what the implications are, and also how we can help advocate to get the best care for our trans kids. So thank you again. And I want to take an opportunity to thank all our presenters today. I just am always amazed at how much I take away from this conference. I think we've had wonderful presenters, and especially want to thank our panelists. Again, their perspective as youth are just always so helpful for us as providers, I think. So be sure to fill out your evaluations and get credit for this conference. And we're hoping to see you back again next year. And if you have ideas to share as to topics that you would find helpful to discuss or address, please share them with us on the evaluations. And in the meantime, I'll just wish you a wonderful weekend. Thanks again.